Okay, so thank you very much and welcome everyone. So my full name is Milada Walková, but please call me Millie. And today I will be talking about developing EAP knowledge base for teaching academic writing. So, see if I can make it to the next slide.
Yeah, it's not moving at the moment, but
no. Okay.
That's
Did
it.
this work? Okay,
Yep,
thank you.
there we go.
So I work at the University of Leeds, where I teach English for academic purposes, and I'm also a teacher educator. I am involved in several modules on our new master's program in teaching EAP. My research interests include, of course, academic writing, but also materials development, scholarship of EAP and doctoral education. And I have done a lot of academic writing myself. To date, I've got 41 peer-reviewed publications, and the latest one is an authored book for EAP practitioners on teaching academic writing. So what I'll be talking about today, a lot of it is from the book, but some of it is also from my current work. So I will first talk about several models of knowledge base, and I will propose my own model of knowledge base for EAP that I'm currently working on. Then I'll propose how, generally speaking, practitioners can access knowledge and develop knowledge base. Then I'll talk about several misconceptions about academic writing and teaching academic writing that I have seen among some EAP practitioners. So I've got 12 misconceptions that I've put under 4 areas. And do I have 12? I think so. And finally, I will propose some frameworks which we can draw on to avoid these misconceptions. And I'm not saying these are the only frameworks. I'm just going to present those that I myself have found useful in understanding these things. So if your favorite framework is not there, it's because I haven't been using it. Doesn't mean it's not appropriate, it's not useful. Okay, so I'll start by presenting the models of knowledge base. And I'll start with models of knowledge base for teachers, generally speaking, so not just for EAP. In 1986, Lee Schulman published an influential paper in which he essentially proposed a model of a teacher's knowledge base. And he pointed out that in the history of pedagogy, at one point there was an overemphasis on the knowledge of the subject matter or content. So for example, a maths teacher needed to know maths, and there was not enough focus on their teaching skills as such. So subject matter essentially was assumed to make a good teacher. And Schulman claims that at another point in the history of pedagogy, there was an overemphasis on pedagogical knowledge. So it was the opposite. There was emphasis on teaching skills, overlooking the knowledge of subject matter. Now, Schulman in his paper said that both are important, and he also proposed the concept of pedagogical content knowledge, which means how do we effectively teach our subject matter? So it's really more than a combination of the two. It's very specific knowledge. A year later, he published another paper where he added more to his original 3 elements. So he mentioned that teachers should know their learners, the curriculum, the context from the micro context of the classroom through the meso context of the institution to the macro context of the national education system, and also philosophical knowledge of education. So values and purposes of education. And Schulman also said, and possibly other elements as well. So he suggested that the list is not finite. So we can see that he added and he made his model more complex or even complicated. In 1990, Grossman essentially took Schulman's original model, and the things he added, most of them she subsumed under one element, knowledge of context. So that would be knowledge of context as understood in Schulman, but also knowledge of the curriculum of the learners. So it's essentially the same components, but in a more simplified version because we've got only 4 elements. And now I'm moving on to a model of knowledge base for EAP as part of language for specific purposes. So Ferguson's 1997 model was proposed for languages for specific purposes, and it has 3 elements: the sociological knowledge of disciplines, so that would include values and practices. So for example, if I'm teaching ESEP in chemistry, it's good for me to know about the social aspects of chemistry. Epistemological knowledge of disciplines, so that means how knowledge is created, how it's validated. So again, depending on discipline in which I'm embedded in, it's useful to know. And we're of course not subject specialists, but we need to have some knowledge because these 2 things have impact on the 3rd element, which is linguistic knowledge. Now, for someone in EGAP, this still applies because you wouldn't go into much depth, but you need to be aware of the differences between the disciplines of the students in your class. So what I propose in my current work in progress is taking Grossman's model of 4 elements and combining it with Ferguson's model. So essentially, EAP knowledge base includes knowledge of context, pedagogical knowledge, subject matter knowledge, which includes sociological, epistemological, and linguistic knowledge, and pedagogical content knowledge. And now I will talk about each of these components briefly. So knowledge of context can be at the macro level, so it can be national and international context. So for EAP practitioners, this can include government policies that affect international students or students going to study abroad. It can include fees that students and international students in particular pay. Then it's the meso-context of the institution, but also of the module. So it's things like what English language requirements are there for students' entry, for their progression, how do they progress, or how do they move on from one level of study to another, what EAP support is available, how much time is given, and even where does the EAP center sit in the university. So it's also about EAP, not just about the disciplines of our students. Module context is important, so we can be at the same institution, and yet our context can be very different if we teach on pre-sessional, in-sessional, foundation. So again, that's also important. And then the very micro context of the students in our cohort, in our class. Now, as EAP practitioners, we develop the knowledge of context by being in that context. So by observing, by talking to colleagues, by reading documentation. And we have to be mindful that this context shifts easily. So even between modules in the same institution, as I said. So the knowledge we develop within one context may or may not be transferable to another context. So probably it will be transferable, but only to to a certain extent, and the greater the difference is, the less we can transfer that knowledge. So it's something we need to be mindful of. Moving on to pedagogical knowledge. This includes traditional areas such as methods of instruction, methods of assessment, class management, but also more recent developments such as use of technology, inclusivity, decolonization, social justice, and others. Now, notice here that I put technology under pedagogical knowledge. I am aware that there are other models which I didn't talk about. So if you're familiar with TPEC, that has technological knowledge as a separate element. But for me, this is part of pedagogical knowledge. Now, as EAP practitioners, we develop pedagogical knowledge through our initial teacher training and then in service. And our institution might be very helpful in helping us develop in this area. So, for example, at my university, there's currently a lot of support for teachers on generative AI. There's been a lot of support on producing accessible materials and so on, because this is important for, and this is relevant for teachers across the university. And it's important for the university that we keep up to date with this. So there's a lot of support available, depending on your institution, of course. Now, this is good, but we need to be mindful that it's just one area of our knowledge, and we shouldn't forget the other areas at the because we're perhaps bombarded by our institution offering support in this area. So subject matter and pedagogical content knowledge will be specific to EAP. So the larger university won't be able to help us develop in this. Our EAP center might be able to, depending perhaps on the size of the center. And then we've got these cross-institutional networks event, just like this very SIG, that can help us develop subject matter and pedagogical content knowledge. So as I said, subject matter knowledge includes sociological knowledge, values and practices, epistemological knowledge, knowledge creation and validation, and then how these two impact the language within disciplines. So that would be what genres are valued and frequently used, what discourse is used in written texts of the discipline. And finally, pedagogical content knowledge includes things like what will students learn in an EAP module and why will they learn this? Excuse me. What do I as a teacher need to know that I won't tell students? Because teaching is not telling everything we know. That's subject matter, everything we know. Pedagogical content knowledge is selecting from that content that is relevant to the students, scaffolding it to the students, making it accessible to students. So it's things like, how do I present and explain the content? What examples, metaphors, anecdotes am I going to use? How will I engage students in active learning? It's also things like, when students come to my EAP module, what are they likely to know already? And even what misconceptions are they likely to have when they come? And then from the content that I teach them, which content are they likely to find easy? And what content are they likely to struggle with? And pedagogical content knowledge also includes drawing connections between concepts, between individual lessons, between lessons and the syllabus. So connections which might not be obvious to our students, but making them aware of these connections helps their learning.